Tim Curry is more than just a creative person. He is among the last enduring embers of a time when performing was a bold form of change as well as amusement. His work revolutionized what it means to be memorable, from the terrifying terror of Pennywise to the crazy seduction of Furter and Dr. Frank in the Rocky Terror Picture Show. He is more of a shapeshifter of emotion than an actor, a presence that haunted every stage and screen he touched, a voice that could change from laughter to horror. But beneath that genius lie aches and wounds that are so deeply etched that they will never go away. As if fate hadn't given up yet, a terrible storm in his later years left him confined to a wheelchair and without a spouse or kids to support him, while everyone stared in wonder at his anguish and unwavering fortitude. Tim Curry is still a mystery, at the age of 79, a living representation, who battles darkness greater than any part he has ever played while carrying brilliance. Remember to hit like before we start, as a way to honor this incredible talent. A child with a flame too bright for such silent walls, was born in a modest home founded on prayer and music. However, nobody had any idea how harshly the storms of fate would eventually hit. He arrived in Cheshire, England, in the spring of 1946, and went by the name Timothy James Curry. And all their simplicity, his early years bore the silent burden of fate. James, his father, was a chaplain in the Royal Navy. He was a disciplined and devout man, whose presence provided stability to the home. Patricia, his mother, was a school secretary, who patiently and devotedly raised her kids. His sister Judith transformed their modest lodgings into a haven of song and hope by occupying their days with delicate melodies at the piano. Although it wasn't a glamorous existence, it was one based on singing, religion, and dignity, and it appeared indestructible for a while. But there was always movement, even in this soft rhythm. From Hong Kong to Malta and back to England, the family followed the ebb and flow of naval service. Every new horizon brings wonder, but it also instills in young Tim the pain of transience and a sense of never quite fitting in. Such shifting footing could be unnerving to a boy. But one thing remained constant throughout. In every unfamiliar place, his father's steady hand serves as a compass. The silent certainty that, wherever his father stood, home was wherever the Navy put them. The year that broke everything then arrived. Tim's father died of pneumonia in the winter of 1958, when he was only 12 years old. He was snatched from him with ruthless cruelty, shattering the family's foundation and leaving a void that could never be filled by him or a piano note. In addition to losing a parent, the compass that guides a youngster toward manhood was also tragically lost, and his childhood broke apart in that one season. Once molded by prayer, the house is now overshadowed by sorrow. While Judith drowned her sorrows in the piano, her delicate music now shaking with grief, his mother, forced to face the terrible load alone, quietly persevered in keeping the family together. Tim, who was still only a youngster, was forced to deal with issues that were much too serious for his age. The tragedy defined him rather than just shattering him. He was sent to the stiff corridors of boarding school, distant from the comforts of home, where he was surrounded by camaraderie that sounded fake and laughter that seemed empty. But even in that solitude, something sparked. His voice, haunting and tenacious, came out via song, like though sadness itself had thumped into his chest. A sound that attracted the attention of educators and fellow students, who perceived it as something unique. He found that his own voice may provide companionship, solace, and even survival on those lonely nights, when silence pressed too hard. He would think years later that he never chose to be funny or perform. They served as lifelines. Indeed, his childhood traumas had been inscribed with that fact. This youngster was not raised in poverty or starvation, but rather with heartbreaks and emotional scars that never completely went away. However, a gift unlike any other emerged from those shadows, an artist who, having carried them all long before he ever set foot on a stage, was able to express both tragedy and humor, ecstasy and fear. The foundation of Tim Curry's future was laid throughout his early years. A resilience developed in the quiet of absence, a gash etched by heartbreaking loss, and a spark of brilliance born in a humble home. It was the start of a tale that would one day, not because of the suffering, but because of it, astound the world. That quiet followed the youngster into adulthood after he had buried his father when he was 12. And he spilled that quiet onto the stage. Teachers at Kingswood School observed a voice that appeared to emerge from the very midst of grief. And the same voice shocked both academics and students. At the University of Birmingham, in the middle of the 1960s, he was no longer the reserved child who had suffered a loss. He was a budding artist, motivated by the desire to not just perform but also to be heard, to turn grief into presence. Curry made his professional debut in 1968, at the age of 22, thanks to Hair, the rock musical that enthralled a generation and scandalized conservatives. Raw, unrepentant, and fearless of condemnation, it was a baptism of fire. The anarchy of Hair was freedom for a young guy who had been shaped by discipline and shadowed by tragedy. His voice soared on that stage. He lost the restraint on his body, and he experienced the unquestionable electricity of being seen for the first time since the passing of his father. Even so, it was not simple. The theater industry in London was brutal, full of aspirational artists, and a mistake might ruin a career before it even started. However, Tim accepted the risk as if he had nothing else to lose. Then 1973 arrived, bringing with it the role that would come to define him and alter popular culture in general. He donned high heels and fishnet stockings to create Doctor at the Royal Court Theatre. Rocky Horror shows, Furter and Frank. The persona seemed ridiculous, even hideous on paper. Under Curry's care, he became legendary. Part liberation prophet, part monster, part seducer. He made bold decisions, not flinching from ridicule or straddling the thin line between gender and identity. But there was a price for that audacity. Such a job could ruin reputations, draw harsh criticism, or permanently brand an actor in a time when prejudice still exists. Curry accepted the chance, fully aware of the risk, because there was more to the glitter than meets the eye. Through the mask, he was exposing his soul. Despite their occasional revulsion, laughter, cheers, and gasps, audiences never forgot him. There was something tragic going on behind the laughter and mascara. The loss of his early years, the anguish of bereavement, and the intense need for approval. Frank-N-Furter seemed to be pulsing with every broken fragment of his past, transforming comedy into tragedy and parody into humanity. Shock was not the foundation of the Rocky Horror phenomenon. Curry personified the contradictions we all possess, which is why it persisted. Ecstasy and sadness, seduction and loneliness, strength and fragility. Curry would eventually admit years after that he never chose to be funny or perform. They served as lifelines. The world finally witnessed that lifeline stretched across a stage in Frank-N-Furter, a man who turned his suffering into a sight as eerie as it was freeing. After leaving in silence, the youngster made a yell that reverberated all throughout the earth. Tim Curry discovered a mirror, not simply a role, in that odd figure covered in sequins. A location where genius and longing met, where a wounded soul at last cried out to be seen. Tim Curry stopped being just an actor the night he walked onto the stage wearing high heels and sequins. He turned into a revolution. Frank-N-Furter did more than merely startle viewers. Only a select number ever taste the immortality he bestowed upon Curry, by rewriting the vocabulary of performance. However, Curry later acknowledged that the victory had a sad irony that plagued him. "I have no desire to spend my entire life ensnared in fishnets." He was in danger of becoming imprisoned in his genius, by the same part that made him memorable. He rebelled and fought back. Curry threw himself into every aspect of the craft, determined to never be confined by a single mask. As Pennywise, he converted chaos into incisive humor and clues before turning to fear and freezing the blood of a whole generation. With his cunning mischievousness in Home Alone 2 and his daring adventure in Muppet Treasure Island, he fit well in with family movies. His range was demonstrated by each performance, but there was an unrelenting truth hidden behind the expertise. He was burning away the hours that could have been spent with family or loved ones, working himself to the bone and giving his all to his craft. He has everything but balance because of his fame. The theater continued to be his most intense battleground. He was a chillingly accurate representation of jealousy and Amdis. As Solari, he unleashed ridiculousness, with reckless abandon with the Pirates of Penzance, and later Spamalot. He was praised by critics for playing roles that were unattainable, and for leaping where others shuddered. However, there was a price for the applause. Every curtain cry thundered with victory, and every subsequent hush was ruthlessly heavy. He acknowledged in interviews that the silence is frequently deafening, and that applause wanes more quickly than people realize. Few people ever really knew the man who strolled into the night by himself when the lights went down. Despite the admiration of crowds, his voice even became legendary. His silky tones, which were etched over decades of animation, portrayed villains, cunning people, and idealists. He was so unique that he may still be heard in the memory of 1990s kids. Captain Hook's daytime, Emmy validated what viewers already sensed. A generation may be commanded by his voice alone. He was both a lullaby and a horror to many houses, simultaneously captivating and unnerving. But while his creative output increased, his personal life dwindled. No partner to celebrate successes with, no kids waiting at home. He used to say, "I've always kept my private life private." The words held the silent weight of sacrifice, even if they sounded like choices. It is his genius's tragic irony. The area where common pleasures may have existed was engulfed by the same fire that created his fame. Performance and humor were not extravagances. They were lifelines, Curry once thought. As a result, he continued to go higher and higher, while carrying a growing amount of acclaim for each accomplishment. It raged in the spotlight. The world applauded. However, as it all subsided, Tim Curry found himself back in rooms as silent as the loss of his youth that had initially molded him, still troubled by the same devastating query. Will anyone ever see me? Nor as a figure, nor as a myth, but just as me. However, praise cannot shield a man from the harsh realities of life. Fate was arranging its darkest curtain off stage, away from the roar of the throng. The world Tim Curry returned to, once the limelight went out, was much more subdued and vulnerable, despite all the glory he had created out on stage and television. And it started to fall apart in the late 1990s. Long after his father's passing, his mother, Patricia, had been his rock. Although her title was school secretary, she was actually the family's stronghold. When sadness first rocked their home, it was the lady who kept everything together. The voice that kept young Tim afloat in times of grief could have drowned him. She was more than just his mother to him. She was the final reminder that home was still there. But one day at a time, disease has a way of stealing strength. And over those latter years, Curry looked on helplessly as the once unflappable woman started to falter. The same voice that had prayed over him as a boy turned weak, and the same hands that had scrawled notes for schoolchildren now shook. The greatest irony for a son who had made a living on imposing stages was that he was powerless in this situation. No standing ovation, no acclaim, and no part could reverse the momentum that was sweeping her away. Patricia passed away in 1999, following a protracted and private fight. As he stood at her grave, Curry, who was then at the pinnacle of his popularity, felt the years fall away. He was no longer the well-known actor who could make millions of people laugh with a single look or frighten the globe as Pennywise. He was a boy again at that instant. After losing his father, the 12-year-old is now losing the mother who has supported him through all of life's ups and downs. The stage lights had long since gone out, and the cameras were far away. All that was left was quiet, suffocating, ruthless silence. In the eyes of the public, fame might move mountains, but it couldn't make up for the void her absence left in his heart. Tim Curry lost more than just his mother. He also lost the last anchor of stability and the last link to a grief-stricken boyhood. 2 years later, fate struck more severely and brutally. His mother's death had just started to heal when he was struck again. At the center of his earliest memories, this time, a brain tumor was discovered in Judith, his cherished sister and the talented pianist whose fingers had once filled their childhood home with delicate tunes. The news was too much for Tim to handle. More than a sibling, she had been. Long before anyone knew his name, she was the one who had first given his voice melody. She had sat at the piano and listened to him sing, fusing song and sound into a harmony that bonded them. The harsh symmetry of fate became more apparent as her sickness worsened. Tim, who had dedicated his life to performing, was powerless to stop the music from escaping her. Once dancing on ivory keys, those hands were now weaker. The same sister who had cheered him up with her music now faced an unwinnable war. Losing her would be like losing the very music that has always been a part of his soul, since his creativity has always been rooted in his family. The inevitable arrived in 2001. The piano became quiet as Judith passed away. That quiet meant more to Tim Curry than just being absent. It was finality. The instrument that had once carried their childhood laughter and their father's death grief was now motionless, collecting dust, its notes frozen in memory. He had lost his mother in his 50s, his father when he was 12, and now, in the final echo of fate, his sister, who served as both a mirror and an anchor. The last two foundations of his family, the sister who understood him, and the mother who reared him, were gone in just 2 short years. Every night, the man who had filled theaters with cheers and screens, with voices that would never be forgotten, returned to a world devoid of its most personal sound. The silent certainty that he was known to someone at home, not as a person, not as a myth, but just as Tim. He felt the ruthless weight of the quiet, which was much heavier than any stage could support. Furthermore, His private life provided no solace if fate had robbed him of his family. For all the seducers, villains, and dreamers that Tim Curry personified, his own story was characterized by loneliness rather than romance. Although he previously acknowledged that he had come close to marriage, he never got married and had no kids. Ultimately, he remained true to his commitment to art. It was a deliberate decision to zealously protect his privacy, in order to create a barrier between the man and the myth, between the roles that the world loved and the heart that it never really knew. It was neither scandal nor resentment. Relationship rumors circulated over the years, with fleeting flashes in the media, implying that there might be a person hiding behind the mask. Curry, however, never validated them, and never stoked the public's desire for admission. He once said simply, "I've always kept my private life private." This restraint appeared mysterious, even aggravating, to those outside of his circle. It was dignity to him. However, that dignity came at a high price. Without a companion by his side, triumphs were celebrated. Applause that ended in rooms where no voice ever responded, and triumphs without a hand to grasp. It was cruelly ironic. He had the ability to captivate millions of people, frighten generations, or make entire theaters burst out laughing on stage and cinema. The silence at home, however, was more profound than any performance break. As the curtain came down, his wit never faltered, not even when he was restrained or when his words failed him. Although they became less frequent, public appearances remained. He walked on stage to accept a Career Achievement Award in 2015. The crowd stood up in respect for Pennywise, neither in the light-hearted manner of Rocky Horror, nor out of fear of him. Tim Curry was seated here, physically altered and frail, yet exuding the same aura that had previously packed theaters. A character did not receive the ovation. It was for tenacity, bravery, and the simple act of not bowing. After that, he avoided the spotlight of red carpets, in favor of the more sedate havens of voice work, exclusive conventions, and private parties. Even with the changes, his voice was still distinctive, mercurial, velvet-edged with steel, and yet able to evoke both awe and terror. For fans, a brief grin or a few words were equivalent to miracles, evidence that despite the storm, he had survived it. However, the cost was constant, despite the courageous humor and infrequent grins. For a guy who had proclaimed performing his lifeline, his birthright was taken, his independence was shattered, his freedom of movement was restricted, and he lost the seamless mastery of his own voice. The most fundamental reality was evident. They had ripped that lifeline away. Curry, however, was not content to let the story stop there. He changed the definition of performance. Every wheelchair push became a spectacle. Each halting phrase was a defiant speech. A silent standing ovation was penned for each day that went by. He went from being a stage conqueror to a survival warrior after the stroke. He had evolved into something more than the frenzied entertainer or the frightful clown. A man who faced fate without witnesses, who transformed solitude into strength, and who endured anguish with dignity, and yet succeeded nonetheless. 2012 was not Tim Curry's last year. The rebirth was harsh. A new stage emerged, replacing the one he had previously controlled. The silent theater of perseverance. Survival itself became his ultimate defining role. If performance had been his lifeline, carried in silence, etched in pain, and crowned with a bravery so fierce that it will reverberate long after the curtain has fallen, this performance was not done for applause or illuminated by spotlights. Tim Curry, who is 79 years old, leads a life that has been altered by fate, but is still lighted by the unquenchable flame. Even though his stroke in 2012 limited his mobility and hindered his speech, it was unable to stop the spirit that revolutionized cinema and turned stages upside down. His voice turned into wings when his legs grew tired. He opted for softer stages instead of walking the red carpet or putting up with the harsh cadence of shows, where his velvet timbre continued to do its magic in the recording booth. Infrequent appearances that reminded the public that the man himself still survived, as well as carefully selected events where his cunning smile felt like a blessing. In a silent victory of perseverance, he adjusted to the limitations of his body and reappeared in the movie stream in 2024. Additionally, his eagerly anticipated memoir, Vagabond, will finally put his story into words in 2025. Possibly the most personal admission he has ever made. His life takes place in Los Angeles, where he has resided since the late 1980s, away from the spotlight. His house, which is surrounded by woods and has a classical appeal, is a reflection of the guy himself, private, respectable, and resilient. Lilies and roses bloom like defiant deeds in the yard he manages, Every petal serves as a reminder that even in quiet, beauty may flourish. He now uses gardening as a form of therapy, a conversation with nature in which each seed he plants is an expression of optimism. Nobody in the world is aware of who spends those hours with him. There are no stories about children or public records of a spouse. What is known is that he protects his private, as if it were the final bastion of his independence. But he takes care when it is required. Those who see him often see what they always saw, even though he may seem weak to others. A tinge of mischief in the eyes, a smile that suggests an unconscious jest, an unquenchable presence. The stroke's shadow is still there. The chair, the more deliberate speech, the subdued body language. Even so, these have been incorporated into his artistic style. Supporters portray a dignified, serene, peaceful, and unbroken man, rather than one who has been diminished. Every presentation, no matter how short, feels like an uncommon performance that is lived rather than manufactured or practiced. Additionally, his greetings to his admirers are evidence of a continuous miracle, rather than a relic from the past. Legacy, on the other hand, transcends all phases. Others see him as the golden voice that permeated the realms of video games and animation, effortlessly switching between lullaby and nightmare. And to innumerable others, he is the survivor whose fortitude in the face of disaster became part of his mythology. His survival serves as a reminder that recovery may be just as heroic as any theatrical stage, and that resiliency itself can be an artistic medium. His closest friends and family talk about his character rather than his popularity. They remember his civility, his sardonic humor, and his capacity to put people at ease despite his own physical shortcomings. He has stuck to the one thing that has always made him who he is. When words failed, technical was his language, his breath, his means of survival, and the means by which he conveyed love, sorrow, and joy. Thus, Tim Curry is not silent, even if he lives in a peaceful neighborhood in Los Angeles, where the sound of traffic is muffled by the sound of leaves rustling. His voice is still heard in records, movies, and recollections that millions of people have preserved. Every flower he cares for in his garden is a poem against the stillness. Yes, he goes alone, but he never feels lonely. For every admirer who continues to chuckle at his humor, shudder at Pennywise, sing in stony dread, and walk with him in spirit. His bravery in enduring illness, loneliness, and bereavement may be his greatest achievement, rather than the roles that made him famous. It is the unsung triumph of maintaining dignity in the face of fate's attempts to take it away. His outfits, his laughs, his villains, and his heroes are all remembered by the world. Perhaps Tim Curry's greatest legacy, however, is that, despite losing the stage, he found another in survival and performed it with such bravery that suffering became something that would never die. Tell us whose tale of tenacity you would like us to celebrate next in the comments section below, if his voice or laughter ever moved you as a child. Because when we think about them, we also think of how resilient we are.